My name is Dr. Alina Martinez. I'm 42 years old, and I learned that pride can make people blind when my own father stood in front of his business partners and used my life as a cautionary tale about failure. She couldn't even afford college, my father said, his voice carrying across the private dining room of the Waldorf Club. Had to go to community college. Now she's pushing 40, still renting, no husband, no real career to speak of. I stood in the doorway of that mahogany-paneled room, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, my dark hair pulled into a messy bun. I'd driven 3 hours to surprise my father on his 70th birthday, only to arrive early and hear myself being discussed like a case study in disappointment. My younger brother David sat at the table next to Dad, nodding along in his tailored suit, his Rolex catching the light from the crystal chandelier. He joined the family real estate business right after his bachelor's degree from state, and our father never let me forget that David had made the smart choice while I'd wandered off into poverty and obscurity. It's a shame, really, my father continued, warming to his theme in front of his wealthy colleagues. I offered to pay for a proper university, told her she could study business, join the company. But no, she had to be stubborn, had to do it her way. And look where it got her. Marcus Chen, one of Dad's oldest business associates, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd known me since I was 10 years old, had watched me grow up at company picnics and holiday parties. But he said nothing as my father dismantled my life for entertainment. She's teaching now, Dad said with a dismissive wave of his hand. At some school nobody's ever heard of, makes barely enough to survive, lives in a tiny apartment in Cambridge, can't even afford a decent car. The irony wasn't lost on me. Cambridge, Massachusetts, home to 2 of the most prestigious universities in the world. But my father had never asked which school, never inquired about the details of my teaching position, never wondered why I'd stayed in one of the most expensive cities in America if I was truly struggling. I could have interrupted then, could have walked into that room and confronted him. But 17 years of academic training had taught me the value of patience, of gathering all the evidence before presenting your case. So I waited, listening as my father continued his performance. The worst part is the student loans, he said, shaking his head with practiced sorrow. She'll be paying those off for the rest of her life. All that education, and for what? To live paycheck to paycheck. I should have forced her to be practical. David finally spoke up, his voice carrying the smugness of the favored child. Alina was always too idealistic, Dad. Too focused on learning for learning's sake. She never understood that education is supposed to lead to financial success. The other men at the table nodded sagely, their combined net worth probably exceeding several $100 million. Self-made men who'd built empires through real estate, investments, and business acumen. Men who measured success in portfolio value and property holdings. I thought about my own apartment then, the modest 2-bedroom in Cambridge that my father would consider inadequate. The 14-year-old Honda Civic I drove that he'd called an embarrassment last Thanksgiving. The simple clothing I preferred over designer labels. The life I'd chosen deliberately, carefully, for reasons he'd never bothered to understand. You know what I tell young people now? My father said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed his own narrative. I tell them to look at both my children. David chose security and success. Alina chose ideology and struggle. One is thriving. One is barely surviving. That's the lesson. The general murmur of agreement circled the table. These men had sent their own children to prestigious schools, but always with the expectation of return on investment. Law school, medical school, MBA programs, degrees that led to country club memberships and vacation homes in the Hamptons. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen and saw an email notification from my department chair. Subject line read, Time magazine interview confirmed. I silenced the phone and continued listening. The thing about Alina, my father said, his voice taking on a tone of paternal disappointment that made my chest tighten, is that she's brilliant. Everyone always said she was the smart one. Straight A's, perfect test scores, full scholarship to community college because that was all she could get. But brilliance without direction is just wasted potential. I'd heard versions of this speech my entire adult life. At holidays, at family gatherings, whenever the subject of my choices came up. My father had constructed an entire narrative about my life based on assumptions, partial information, and his own definitions of success and failure. And because I'd never corrected him, never felt the need to justify my choices, The narrative had calcified into fact in his mind. She could have had everything, Dad continued. Corner office, company car, six-figure salary by 30. Instead, she's probably grading papers right now in some cramped office, wondering how she's going to make rent. David's wife, Melissa, had entered the room at some point, standing near the bar with a champagne flute in her hand. She caught my eye and her face went pale. Unlike my father and brother, she'd actually visited my apartment once 3 years ago. She'd seen the space, the neighborhood, though even she didn't know the full story. The dinner was being called to order, wait staff entering with the first course. My father's birthday celebration, attended by the elite of the city's business community. I'd planned to slip in quietly, surprise him with the gift I'd brought, a first edition book he'd mentioned wanting years ago. Instead, I'd received an education in how my own family perceived me. As the servers began placing plates, I made my decision. I walked into the dining room, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Marcus saw me first, his eyes widening with recognition and what might have been embarrassment. Then David noticed, his face freezing mid-laugh at something Dad had said. My father turned, following their gazes, and found me standing 5 feet behind his chair. "Alina," he said, his voice shifting instantly to forced cheerfulness. "What are you doing here?" "I heard you were telling everyone about my life," I replied calmly. I thought I should probably be here for that conversation. The room went completely quiet except for the soft clink of silverware as a waiter hastily retreated toward the kitchen. "Dad, you didn't mention Alina was coming," David said weakly, as if my presence was the problem rather than the content of the conversation I'd overheard. "I wasn't supposed to arrive until later," I said, my voice steady and clear. "But I finished early and thought I'd surprise you, Dad. Happy birthday." My father had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he recovered quickly, defaulting to the same dismissive tone he'd always used when I challenged him. "Well, you're here now. Join us. We were just talking about family." I remained standing, my hands relaxed at my sides, my posture calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Actually, Dad, you were talking about me. And since I'm apparently the subject of tonight's entertainment, I think your guests deserve to hear the full story, not just your version of it." My father's jaw tightened, a sign I recognized from childhood. He didn't like being contradicted, especially not in front of his business associates. "Alina, this isn't the time or place," he said quietly, a warning in his tone. "I disagree," I replied. "You just spent the last 15 minutes explaining to these men how my life choices led to failure and poverty. I think I'm entitled to provide some context." Marcus Chen cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should give you some family privacy." "No," I said firmly. "Please stay. My father made these statements in front of you. You deserve to hear the truth." I walked slowly around the table, making eye contact with each man present. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable. David had gone completely still, his hands gripping his napkin like a lifeline. "You're right about some things, Dad," I began. "I did go to community college. I attended Middlesex Community College in Massachusetts for 2 years. You offered to pay for a traditional 4-year university, and I turned you down." My father nodded, vindicated. "See, she admits it." "But I turned you down," I continued, "because I'd received a full academic scholarship to MIT that covered tuition, room, and board. I chose community college for my first 2 years to save money and graduate completely debt-free." The silence that followed was profound. "I went to MIT, Dad, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I completed my bachelor's degree in 3 years total instead of 4, graduated summa cum laude with a double major in physics and mathematics." My father's face had gone from confident to confused. "You said you went to community college." "I did," I replied. "For 2 years, then I transferred. It's a common pathway for students who want to save money. I wrote my senior thesis on quantum computing applications, and it was published in Physical Review Letters before I even graduated." One of the business partners, a man named Robert Sterling, leaned forward. "Physical Review Letters? That's one of the top physics journals in the world." I nodded. It was cited 847 times in the first 3 years. It's now considered foundational work in the field. David found his voice, though it came out strained. "You never told us you went to MIT. You never asked," I said simply. "You assumed community college was the end of the story, and I never felt the need to correct assumptions that revealed more about you than about me." My father was staring at me as if I were a stranger. "But you said you were teaching." "At some school nobody's heard of. I am teaching," I confirmed. I've been teaching for 12 years at MIT, where I'm currently a tenured full professor in the Department of Physics. The collective intake of breath around the table was audible. Marcus Chen's champagne glass paused halfway to his lips. "You're a professor at MIT?" My father said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Full professor," I clarified. I received tenure 6 years ago at 36, making me one of the youngest tenured faculty members in the department's history. I run a research laboratory with 14 graduate students and postdoctoral researchers. My lab's annual funding from the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and private grants exceeds $4 million. The numbers hung in the air like smoke. $4 million, Robert Sterling repeated, clearly doing mental calculations about what that meant in terms of academic prestige and real-world value. My father had gone pale. His carefully constructed narrative was crumbling, and he seemed unable to process the reality I was presenting. "You mentioned my student loans, Dad," I continued. "You're right that I had them. Past tense. I paid off all $47,000 within 3 years of starting my postdoctoral fellowship, because MIT's starting salary for assistant professors in STEM fields is quite comfortable. My current salary, as a full professor with my level of funding and publication record, is $246,000 annually, plus consulting fees." David made a sound somewhere between a cough and a gasp. "That's more than I make." "Significantly more," I agreed. "But I don't measure success by salary alone, which is why I've never mentioned it." Melissa was now staring at her husband with an expression I couldn't quite read. She'd known I taught at a prestigious school, but even she hadn't known the full extent of my position. "You talked about my tiny apartment in Cambridge," I said, turning back to my father. "I own a 3-bedroom condominium 3 blocks from Harvard Square. I purchased it 8 years ago for $1.2 million. It's now worth approximately $2.1 million. I also own a small cabin in Vermont that I use for writing and research. The mortgage on the Cambridge property is paid off. The Vermont property was purchased with cash." My father seemed incapable of speech. His face had gone from pale to flushed, embarrassment warring with disbelief. "And my car," I continued, "the 14-year-old Honda Civic you've mocked at every family gathering. I drive it because it's reliable, fuel-efficient, and parking in Cambridge is challenging. I also own a Tesla Model S that I use for longer trips, but I prefer the Honda for daily commuting. It's practical. You know what I tell young people?" I said, echoing his earlier words. "I tell them that success isn't measured by others' definitions. That choosing a path because it matters to you, because it challenges you intellectually, because it contributes something meaningful to human knowledge, is worth more than any corner office." Marcus Chen was the first to recover his composure. "Dr. Martinez," he said, using my title for the first time, "I apologize for not speaking up earlier. Your father's description didn't match the woman I remembered, but I assumed I'd simply lost touch with your life." "You had," I said without rancor. "We all did. That was partially my choice. I value privacy. I don't post my achievements on social media. I don't send Christmas letters detailing my accomplishments. I let my work speak for itself within the academic community where it matters." My phone buzzed again. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Another email, this one from my literary agent. Subject line: "Book deal final, Cambridge University Press." I looked at my father, whose expression had shifted from shock to something that might have been shame. "Dad, you spent 20 years telling me I'd made terrible choices, that I'd wasted my potential, that I should have joined your business and measured success in quarterly earnings and property acquisitions. But I didn't want that life. I wanted to understand how the universe works at its most fundamental level. I wanted to teach brilliant students who will go on to change the world. I wanted to contribute to human knowledge in a way that will outlast all of us." Robert Sterling spoke quietly. "What's your field of research specifically, Dr. Martinez?" "Quantum information theory and its applications to cryptography and computing," I replied. "My lab is currently working on systems that could revolutionize data security and computational capability. We're not building commercial products. We're doing the foundational science that will make those products possible decades from now." My father finally found his voice. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me believe all these years that you were struggling?" "Because you never asked, Dad," I said, and for the first time, my voice carried the weight of 2 decades of hurt. "You never asked about my research. Never asked which school. Never asked why I stayed in Cambridge if money was so tight. You constructed a narrative based on your assumptions and your values, and you never once wondered if there might be more to the story. I pulled out the chair next to Marcus and sat down, suddenly tired. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every family gathering, I listened to you compare me unfavorably to David. I listened to you tell relatives that I'd thrown away my potential. And I stayed quiet because I thought you'd eventually ask, eventually show interest in what I was actually doing with my life. But you never did. David was staring at the tablecloth, his earlier smugness completely evaporated. Melissa reached over and squeezed my hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity I hadn't expected. The dean of MIT's School of Science called me this morning, I said, looking directly at my father. I've been nominated for the MacArthur Fellowship, the Genius Grant. 25 other faculty members have won it over the years. If I receive it, I'll be in extraordinary company. My father's eyes were shining with what might have been tears. Alina, I had no idea. I know, I said softly. That's the problem, Dad. You had no idea because you never looked beyond your own definition of what my life should be. You saw community college and assumed failure. You saw an old car and assumed poverty. You saw choices different from yours and assumed mistakes. Marcus raised his glass. To Dr. Alina Martinez. To pursuing knowledge over convention. The other men joined the toast, their expressions ranging from admiration to embarrassment. My father lifted his glass last, his hand shaking slightly. To my daughter, he said, his voice thick with emotion, who became extraordinary while I wasn't paying attention. I clinked my glass against his. I was always extraordinary, Dad. You just had to ask. Here's my question for you. If you had Alina's power in that moment, would you have stayed silent as long as she did, or would you have spoken up sooner? Comment your answer below. I'm genuinely curious. And if you loved this story of hidden strength and public vindication, you absolutely need to watch what happens when a woman gets laughed at for driving in Uber, until her passenger reveals she's actually flying Air Force One. That video is up next. Click it now. Subscribe to Untold Revenge, because the best revenge is the truth they never saw coming.